Hi, Yasmin. Hi, Reena. Hey, Pam. Hi, Shilpa. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining in today. All right, guys, I think we can start the session today. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the IB DP extended session today. And my name is Jasmeet. And like you, I have also been an educator. I have taught in India in government schools, and I have been an English and a social science educator. As we wait for others to join in, of course, we would love to know where you're joining us from. So as all of you have been typing in the chat box, this is where you're from. So we just take about a minute or two because I can see a lot of people admitting into the session, and that's when we'll begin. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Preeti. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing your responses. Allow me a moment to just admit a couple of more people. All right, I'm just going to give you a little bit more about Toddle. So Toddle is currently used by about 25,000 educators across 1,100 plus PYP schools and MYP schools. We also have schools from all over the world, US, Asia, Pacific, Europe, Middle East. And the program is also available in Spanish. Just like Toddle for PYP and MYP, Toddle for DP will be a comprehensive end-to-end teaching learning solution. The platform will also include features like curriculum planning and resource library. Now, DP core modules, assessment and feedback, progress reports, student portfolios, family communication, classroom management, and streamlined authorization and evaluation as well is going to be a part of Toddle. We're doing a quick walkthrough just to show you how DP extended essay module today after closing the session at 12:45 p.m. GMT. So do drop into that session using the link that I'm just going to put in the chat if you're interested to explore that. We just move to the housekeeping points now. Donald, if you can just move to the next slide. All right, so we request you all to switch on your videos and put yourselves on mute. Also, please type in your questions in the chat box whenever you have any. At various times, the speaker, that's Donald, will ask you to pause and reflect. So I would request you all to use the chat feature to interact. And while typing into the chat box, please select everyone so that your message is going out to everyone. This meeting has been developed independently from and is not endorsed by IB. And we also thank our speaker, Donald, for generously sharing their learnings at Toddle's EE Cafe. So thank you everybody for joining in today. I hope you all have a lovely session and you take back a lot of learnings from today. One last bit, we're also on social media and we would love for you all to share your learnings from this session using the hashtag EE Cafe. So I'm just going to put down social media links for Toddle in the chat box. So y'all can just use those links to go to Twitter or Instagram and just share your learnings with us. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Yasmin. All right, so I'm going to talk to you today about the extended essay. I have been teaching IB for 17 years. I have worked in schools ranging from MENA region predominantly, which are actually Saudi Arabia. I've worked in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, currently in Qatar. Before that, I was in El Salvador as well. So I have some experience with it. I'm also an IB examiner, as well as I have recently started working with the IB as a curriculum developer. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the way I approach the extended essay, and hopefully you can glean some things from this in your own practice. So we're going to do three things today. I'm going to talk about the nature of the English Lang & Lit extended essay. I'm going to walk you through the process that I walk my students through. And then I'm going to unpack the assessment criteria. And hopefully by the end of this, you will have some good pointers that you can work with when you work with your own students. So let's start. As you know, the extended essay in English is in three categories. There's category one, which is, I would say, straight English. The students are going to be working with English literature. Actually, let me make this clear. Category one and category two are literature assessments. So technically, even the student is doing Lang & Lit or Lit, the extended essays are the same category in category one and category two. So in category one, the students are working with works written originally in English, full stop. And that's it. There are no restrictions as to how many texts they can work with or any type of comparison. As long as the works are written originally in English, that's fine. So you might have them work with a novel by one author. You could have them work with novels by the same author. You could have them work with novels from different authors. As long as it's original in English, that's category one. Category two is a comparison piece. So the students must write a comparison between a work that is originally written in English and a work that is written in another language originally, but translated. And then category three is the language. And the students must work with text types that are language-based. So moving on, just show you a couple of research questions that students have used with me over the years, and they have been successful with those research questions. The first one, this is all category one, these three exemplars. The first one here, the student is looking at the color purple and looking at Their Eyes Were Watching God. This extended essay is a intertextual discussion. They're looking at the way in which Zora Neale Hurston's work sort of acted as a hypertext for Alice Walker's work. And in fact, that's the literary theory that the student worked with, intertextuality. So the first thing I would say to you is for an extended essay to do well, one of the things it probably needs to be grounded in is theory. Now, is that compulsory? No, but the toughest criteria for students to do well on is criterion C, which is critical thinking. And I think one of the ways in which they can improve their critical thinking grades is by incorporating literary theory as a means for their analysis. So category one there was looking at that sort of intertextual relationship between those texts. The second one, second exemplar, looked at Ted Hughes' poems and looked at the impact, what could be gleaned from his poems in terms of the impact it had on his wives. This was a bit biographical-ish, but it went well. The student got an A for it. The third one, the student looked at Handmaid's Tale, and they looked at gender performativity in Handmaid's Tale and used Judith Butler's theory as a means of analyzing the things like the clothing that women wear and the language that was spoken in the novel. Category two, to be honest, very few students really do category two, at least with me. Most students either do category one or category three. This one here, the big thing about category two is A, one text is in translation, and B, it has to be a comparison. So the students must be looking at the comparative relationship of both texts. That might be a bit tricky. The first exemplar, the student was looking at Palestinian diasporic identity, and Mahmoud Darwish is a famous Palestinian poet who promoted nationalism, Palestinian nationalism in his Haifa poems. And the student looked at what was the comparative relationship between Mahmoud Darwish's poems and Naomi Shihab-Nai's poetry. The second one there, the student looked at sort of the intertextual relationship between Zamianti's We and George Orwell's 1984, in terms of how did they both treat the idea of subversive indoctrinations. We was more mathematically based, and Orwell's 1984 is more language based. And so the student was able to look at the similarities, despite the fact that one was using sort of mathematical base for their argument or their subversive theme, while R was using language more so. This comes from the new updated guide. The guide has been updated like I can't remember, but there's a very the guide has been updated. I think it's November 2020 is the most recent iteration of the Lang&Lit guide. And they've done something interesting. What they've done is that they've told us what counts as literary text. Previously, there was some gray area, but there are no more gray areas. The guide has told us explicitly. The one that I draw your attention to here, I think the rest are pretty straightforward, but the one I'd like to draw your attention to is song lyrics. Previously, song lyrics used to be category 3. I've had students who did song lyrics, rap lyrics, and submitted it as category 3, and that was the category it fell under. Now with the new course, song lyrics are now definitively category 1. They're now definitively literature. So just be aware that if you weren't, that's a tricky one, but all song lyrics, regardless of the song lyrics, they're all now category 1 or they're literature. The difference between Cat 1 and Cat 2 is that category 3 is language. That means the student must be looking at language. For example, if you look at the first one there, the student is looking at feminist language in Emma Watson's speech, as well as Malala's speech. So the key issue here to pay attention to category 3 is that the student must focus on language. If the student doesn't focus on language, then they're not doing a category 3. So if you look at the 3 exemplars there, the word language is actually worded into the research questions to ensure that the student stays focused on language elements. Unlike the category 1 and category 2, where I said the focus should be on theory, for this one, to some extent, you might want to think about linguistic elements to focus on a particular language techniques. For example, the student who did feminist language in Emma Watson and Malala's speech, what she did was she looked at speech act theory and looked at the different elements of speech act theory that she could have used to describe Watson's speech versus Malala's speech. So, and then that allowed her again to sort of sound more critical in her discussion. The second one, the student used Orientalism as the lens through which they looked at the advertisements. And in advertisements, yes, you look at visual techniques. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, I'd recommend that the student also focuses on language techniques. So even with the visual element, there has to be a combination of language and visual techniques, or looking at language, looking at visual, or looking at language and visual working together. A side note, that's interesting because that's one of the paper 1 type questions where you look at text and image working together. So for advertisements, you're looking at text and image working together as well. And the third one here, again, another successful one, the student looked at comparing or discussing the way in which the New York Times, which is predominantly a liberal newspaper, versus the Wall Street Journal, I hope I got that right, the Wall Street Journal, which is predominantly conservative, and looked at how both of them used gendered language to discuss or to represent Hillary Wilson during the political campaign, her presidential campaign in 2016. Interesting topics. What I have here on screen are some text types, non-literary text types that historically have been successful with the students I've worked with. If you look at your Lang&Lit guide, page 22 on the new guide, you'll see a full list of what are now considered non-literary text. But some of them, in my opinion, are not necessarily the best for non-literary extended essays. For example, they have artwork on it. Because of the lack of the language element, it's going to be hard to use artwork, at least in my opinion, to do a successful category 3 extended essay. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into our breakout rooms, and we're going to look at the Padlet link and write about your research questions that you would have for your categories. And then we come back and we can discuss those. So what are potential research questions you would have, or maybe your students have, and then we could come back and discuss those. Yasmet?
Yeah, the Padlet link is in the chat box now, and just allow me a minute to create the breakout rooms.
All right, while you're doing that, I'm just looking in the chat to see if there are any questions I could answer. There's one here that says, if the selected text does not have much critical material available, what is the best advice for students? One of the things that the IB says is just that we should guide students along the lines of doing material that is critical. So like young teen novels or Harry Potter, stuff like that. The IB literally tells us to shy away from stuff like that, because there is not much research or much critical analysis that can be done or has been done on works like that. So the hardest part for the student to gain marks on the extended essay is critical thinking. So I always advise students that they should find material that, or text that has been researched, that there's stuff out there that they can actually sink their teeth in terms of secondary sources, because that's big for criterion B, but also C. So we'll discuss the point distribution a little bit later, but that's 12, 18 marks out of 34. So that's why I think the critical material is important.
All right, thanks a lot for answering that, Don. I have the breakout rooms ready. I'm just going to create them.
Another person asked about film and TV script just before you run off. Yes, film and TV script are legitimate extended essay material. The caveat I would say is to make sure that you're analyzing the script more so than the film. So it should be the script in conjunction with maybe stills from the film that highlight the particular language element. For example, let's say you're doing something like an interesting teen movie, although you probably wouldn't do this one, but the hate you give. In that movie, it's interesting how they use filters to match up with certain emotional scenes that the character is saying. So when the character is with her family, the filters are warmer to accentuate or to work along with the language and the feeling and the emotion and the way in which that scene is natural, vis-a-vis when she's in her predominantly white school and the filters are colder. So, you know, things like that are interesting, but yeah, I would make sure that I'm working along with the text, the script, not just the film.
All right, thanks for answering that as well. I'm just going to open all the rooms and we'll see you in the breakout rooms then.
All right, cool. All right, I'm on the Padlet now, just looking at some of the questions, and I'm seeing some interesting questions. I think one person here was...
Were the breakout rooms closed? Because they got disconnected in the middle.
Yes, I believe this was closed. All right, so I'm just looking at some of the questions here and some interesting questions. But someone, I think it's Aditi, who is actually asking a question. She says, I don't have a research question, but she wants some clarity on using literary theory. All right, to begin with, literary theory isn't compulsory. It's a recommendation of mine. It's a way in which I think you can try and capitalize on critical thinking marks, which I believe is the hardest of the criteria to ace for students. So it's not compulsory. A student can do well in an EE without using literary theory. So let's be clear on that one. So I may have put it out there to begin with a little bit too soon or a little bit too forcefully. Lit theory is not a requirement for a student to do well in an EE. What is a requirement is that if it's a literary EE, the student has to analyze literary elements. So you're looking at the big things like theme or plot or characterization, figurative language. Those things must be the forefront of the analysis. And even if the student is doing literary theory, they still have to put the literary elements at the forefront of the analysis. So there's a good one here that I'd like to point out, at least I think it is a good one. Let me see if I can find it again. One that mentioned Freud. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Yeah. In what ways do Freudian concepts of personality help us to understand Ballard's portrait of behavioral regression in high rise? Now, I'll tell you why I like this one. It's clear that the student is going to be looking at characterization. So they've covered the basic element of the requirement, which is to analyze a literary element. So definitely going to be looking at characterization. But this research question has kicked up characterization a notch. So they're not just looking at characterization in a sort of basic way. They're probably going to look at it in terms of maybe the iceberg model, looking at maybe the character's id and what is motivating the character, or what are the social factors, looking at the superego, and so on. So you can see where the student is going to be kicking up a notch in terms of almost looking at it from a university level, almost. That's the impression I get from this. So I'm already impressed with the question. So if I were an examiner and I'm looking at this question, I'm already like perked up to see where the student is going with it. As opposed to if they said just looking at characterization. Okay, you are to look at characterization, but how can you ensure that you're making your research a little bit more critical? So that's one that jumped out at me when I was looking at it. In what ways? Let me just mention this as well. And this is not a hard and fast rule, but for me, I find saying in what ways is better than saying to what extent. Because to what extent is something that you need to prove, but in what ways is something that you can show. And in English, at least for me, proving something is far more difficult than showing something. I can show where the writer is using devices, but it's going to be difficult for me to prove the extent to which this is happening. So I usually recommend to students to say how or in what ways, rather than to what extent. However, students can say to what extent. So bear that in mind. One of the research questions where the student looked at the Hillary Clinton campaign, she did talk about to what extent, because she was looking at the extent to which one newspaper used it versus the other. So she was able to quantify the extent to which Washington Post used gendered language by pointing to examples and quantify the other. So to what extent can work, but I usually tell students, especially in literature, to shy away from to what extent type questions. Yeah, so some interesting questions here. There is one here that says, to what extent is love affected by societal standards? Again, it's clear without saying it explicitly that the student will be looking at love as a theme. So again, that's a good question because it's clear thematically what the student is looking at, and they're looking at that love there. So yeah, so some interesting research questions. I don't know if you have any questions, so we'll move on to questions. So let me, before we do that, sorry, let me share again. Before we do that, I just wanted to raise your attention to what's on screen here. This is the IB's stipulation as of 2019. So SS starting last year had to comply to this rule. The rule is no double dipping. Students cannot use the same material that was taught in class for an extended essay. That rule was not explicitly stated anywhere else. Previously, it's now explicitly stated. So if I teach Handmaid's Tale in school, the student cannot use Handmaid's Tale as its extended essay work. They can still use Margaret Atwood, but they can't use the same novel. All right. Likewise, poetry is a little bit tricky because let's say like one year I was doing Kendrick Lamar and the student wanted to do Kendrick Lamar, but I had done selected works of Kendrick Lamar and not a particular album from Kendrick Lamar. So it became tricky. So I had to advise the student not to do Kendrick Lamar at all because it is questionable as to whether we are double dipping if he does a specific album, even though I did selected songs. So, and this falls on the school and by extension, you, the teacher, to ensure that this happens. And if by any way the IB realizes or finds out that this is the case, then it will come right back to us. So I encourage you to ensure that students do not double dip. The IB goes as far as saying, If you find this out at the latest stage, the student has to redo their EE. It doesn't matter when. All right. So, so let's take some questions. If you have any questions now, you can just pop them in the chat box, and I'll just try and look at a couple of your questions quickly before we move on to the next phase, which is looking at the process. All right, so someone says, does it help to mention literal lens in the research question if the student is going to use it in the essay? That's a wording choice. I mean, I'd say you could. If you look at exemplars that I've put up on the slide, you realize that the students use. So let me just flash back to respond to this one. Let me just go back. Sorry. Let me just go back to some of the research questions that my students used in the past. So this is the category 1. The second one, the student doesn't mention theory and doesn't use theory at all. And they do fine. They did fine. They got an A. The first one, the student does use intertextuality as a theory, but it's not mentioned in the research question. Well, the third one, the student does mention explicitly that they're going to use Judith Butler's theory of performativity. So it's up to you. It's a wording thing. The important thing is how the student uses the theory in the actual essay. So if you want to word it into the research question, that's fine. If not, it doesn't really change anything, at least in my opinion. What is your opinion on Donald Trump research question? I didn't see that question. But I can say to you that I've had a student who did Donald Trump tweets and did well with it. So social media text is a viable option. Of course, they had to look at multiple tweets over a period of time to try and establish some sort of theme, if you want to call it that. Yes, clear literal lens can be used in all categories. In fact, if I just quickly go down to the category 3 ones, you realize here, I can tell you the first one, as I mentioned earlier, the student used speech act theory, linguistic theory in it to make the argument. The second one, the student used Orientalism and then looked at how the language could be analyzed through an Orientalist lens. And the third one, the student used gendered language. So they looked at gendered language theory, different theories revolving around gendered language. I can't remember right now which theory the student used, but the student used a specific gender theory. Gender language theory. Let me see if I can take another one. Hold on. This is jumping too fast for me. Questions are jumping too fast for me.
Should I help you for a few questions from the chat box?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat box. So if you could just, I'm trying to just keep up with the chat box. We're moving a bit too fast.
Sure. No problem.
Could you discuss some of the key differences between developing topic research question for literary essay and HL essay? Oh, wow. I don't think there's significant difference. This is my opinion. I don't think there is a significant difference between the extended essay and the current HL essay. I think the difference is only in length. So then the analysis becomes more condensed for an HL essay. But the development of a topic, I think, can be quite similar. The development of the research question can be quite similar. Again, it becomes a much more condensed process because the HL essay is 1,500 words. So you realize it's a much shorter process. But I think the research question can be quite similar. Any others, Yasmin, that I missed? To teachers, do you explicitly teach theory in class? If so, how do you approach it? Well, I can tell you how I approach it, Robert. For me, all right. So in a previous school where I worked, I had more creative control in terms of my curriculum. So I taught all of my literary books around the lens of post-colonialism. So that means I kind of introduced the kids to postcolonialism as a theory, and then every text I taught allowed the kids to delve into postcolonial studies from a different perspective. So that's one way you could do it. Usually though, let's say feminism, which is probably a theory that is going to be recurrent, I do have an exclusive class where I go through feminism, first wave, second wave, third wave, and I kind of talk to the kids or teach the kids explicitly about feminism, so that when I'm starting to talk about feminism in text, I'm not finding myself having to make pit stops along the way, because they would have already been exposed to the theory. So that's probably how I approach it. All right. And I'll just look at one more. If I can find one more. Can they use novels studied in grade 9, grade 10? I'd say yes, except though grade 9, grade 10, maybe the complexity of the novels might not be the same or rich enough for an extended essay. That would probably be my only caveat where that is concerned. All right, so Yasmin, should I move on?
Yeah, we have just one last question. I'm not sure if you want to take that up right now or if we can take that up later.
All right, let me take a look at it. From Pam, can you give clear advice about using young adult fiction? It's very straightforward. The IB repeatedly in the subject report warns students against using young adult fiction. So personally, I just tell my students no. Can it be done? Yes. Is it risky? Yes. And I'll tell you why it's risky. It's risky simply because there is a chance that the material is not deep enough for critical analysis, or there is not strong secondary sources that the student can use. And those things are important for criterion B, knowledge and understanding, and criterion C, critical thinking. So that's why I would say no. I would advise students against using young adult fiction. That said, it's not impossible that the student can't do it, but again, it's more chancy than if they had done something that is more, acceptable. All right. All right, so I'll move on to the next, take some questions later on. So now I'm going to move into the process really. So this is my process that I've used with my students now for the last 15, 16 years that I've been doing IB extended essays, and it has reaped success. I do have colleagues who use different processes and with success as well. So bear that in mind as I go along. I'll point out some differences between what I do and what I know other colleagues do and do successfully. So the process takes 3 parts for me. There is the research, there is a planning, and then there is the writing. I think the research is the longest part for the student. This is the part they have to get right, because if they get the research right, then I think the writing becomes sort of, I would say not easy, but a lot more fluid as they go along. So the first thing the student has to develop is a topic. For me, I have a discussion with, if it's literature, I tend to ask the students, what have you read? What have you read and what did you like? Because you tend to find that students gravitate towards literature, but they, at least in my experience, they haven't read the book that they want to write about. And that's a no-no, because they're not going to get, they're not going to have much success with a book they haven't read. And if they're going to be reading it for the first time in this process very quickly, they're not going to actually engage with the text well enough to develop a topic. So usually I say to a student, if it's literature, what books have you read recently that you are interested in? One year I had a student who did a novel called Killers of the Flower Moon, which is a text that is a journalistic historical novel that looks at the way in which Native Americans who were placed on oil-rich land were eventually treated. Yeah, it was an interesting novel, but the student had read that novel. And so that became the basis on which they could do their extended essay. The next thing is, once they've done this, I think they need to, with our assistance, figure out the literary or linguistic lens that they want to approach this topic with. So for example, one of the, my current student actually, she's looking at speeches. She's comparing 2 climate change speeches or speeches by 2 persons who are advocating for climate change. And she noticed that there is a difference in the tone of the different speakers. So immediately she's now doing research into different tone of voice. So because she wants to find a sort of linguistic theory that allows her to have a sort of intellectual discussion about the differences in the tone. Rather than just using some very simple adjectives, she wants to be able to analyze it with this sort of linguistic lens. So that means a student now has to search for sources, where am I? Sources, I think I've jumped ahead of myself, but the student has to search for sources, JSTOR, Questia. I'll give you 2 tricks that I learned, that I shared with my students, especially if they don't have access to databases like JSTOR, Questia. I usually have my students type in the name and put the word PDF behind it. If they put PDF behind it, what comes up are PDF documents. And you'll find sometimes that these PDFs are research essays, articles, things like that that are actually worthy of using in their as part of their research. Or the other means is using Google Scholar, which is very useful. The problem with Google Scholar, of course, is that since Google was caught in a copyright scenario, they now blot out pages. But still, the pages that are not blot out of a particular book can still be useful for research. So once they've done that, they have the topic, they've gone off, they've done the linguistic theory, they've done their search for sources. Some schools require students to do an annotated bibliography. I think it's a good thing, but it should be a targeted annotated bibliography. Some schools require the student to do the annotated bibliography without the student really knowing their direction. So I think it's better that you have this sort of discussion about the theory, about the novel or the non-literary text that they're doing. And then from there, the student moves into creating an annotated bibliography. And I think the student should be able to develop a research question once they've done all of that. So that's the next step. The research question is not fixed, I don't think, at least. Most of my students, their research question changed 2 or 3 times throughout the whole process. And when by the time they get to the end, they have reworded, tweaked their research question somewhat. All right. The annotated bibliography, as I mentioned, can be that literary review that the student has to develop. But one of the things that I do have my students do, I have them have a working bibliography. This helps them because in the end, what you find sometimes that the students are scrambling to figure out where they got something from. And as we know, it's very important that students do cite carefully. So having a working bibliography, everything that they've read or everything that they're referencing, they have it there. Sometimes some students just put the links. They copy and paste the link of the thing. Some students are more meticulous, so they would have turned it into an MLA citation. That's up to you, but important thing is that they do keep a list of the sources that they have used, so that when it's time to do the in-text citations or to do the bibliography, they actually have this list of works. Planning. This is the second step, sorry, for me with my students. And once you say 4,000 words, it sounds daunting. So I break it up into bits and pieces for the students so that it becomes a lot more manageable and it doesn't seem as overwhelming as 4,000 words. So the first step is writing introduction. And for me, if you look at it, the 4,000 words, my introduction is 500, my conclusion is 500, and my body chapters are 3,000 combined. So I break it up into little parts. So the introduction is 500, and I'll talk you through the introduction a bit when we go to the assessment criteria. But the introduction, again, is 2 paragraphs of 250 words each. The first paragraph is sort of me setting up how I've gotten to my research question. And the second paragraph is outlining my chapters, what my chapters are going to be about. And so once a student looks at it that way, it becomes at least a little bit more manageable. And then the student can have 2 or 3 chapters, 1,500 or 1,000 words each, depending if they have 2 or 3. Subtopics are not recommended in extended essay for English. So, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, but breaking those up into smaller sections is something that's not recommended. And then of course the conclusion, and I'll go into that a bit again when I look at the criteria, assessment criteria. The conclusion, again, I break it into 2 paragraphs, 250 words each. By the way, this is not fixed. This is just a guide so the students have something to work with in their brain so that they know how they're trying to compartmentalize, maybe how they want to break down these 4,000 words. The final step in the process is the writing. They write an introduction with chapter outlines that I mentioned. Once they've done that, then they go into the process of writing the first draft. I tend to have informal check-ins. For me, my preference is that I supervise students that I teach, because it's much easier to grab a student after class and say, hey, how is this going? And you can have those sort of informal check-ins that way. It's far more difficult, at least in my opinion, to have those sort of informal check-ins with students you don't teach. But I mean, we have different scenarios that we work with. There are times when I'm working with students that I don't teach as well. But it's important, I think, to have these informal check-ins. After the first chapter, I think that one is very critical, because you can capture some of the writing errors the student is making so that these errors are not repeated in the second and the third chapter. So I think these informal check-ins are important in that way. It's important to note, by the way, that according to IB regulations or stipulations, you're only allowed to give written feedback on 1 draft. So you can't give multiple written feedbacks, or you shouldn't give multiple written feedbacks. So my informal checking is more verbal, it's more a discussion. I would look at what they're writing and I would take a look at it and say, this looks good, but think about this, that, small suggestions really, but not written feedback necessarily. And I do this, the second chapters and the third chapter, similar informal check-ins. Another thing that this does is that it helps me with the Viva voucher, because the Viva voucher is supposed to be my way of knowing that the student's work is authentically their work. If I'm having these periodical check-ins as well, these informal check-ins, then I know what's going on in the student's head. I know the progress of the work. So it's easier for me in the Viva voucher to say, or at the end of the Viva voucher, to say that this was my student's work, because I've seen the development of the work over time. Without these form of informal check-ins, I get a rough draft of something that is immaculate almost, and I'm like, I may have questions in my head, and the student is able to pass the Viva voucher, and I still have questions in my head, but how do I sign off on this? Do I sign off on it? I think these informal check-ins help you to, well, it certainly helps me to feel a lot more comfortable with saying that this is my student's work. But I do have a formal interview, which is one of the reflections. I do have it when the student finishes the third draft. And this is where I have a thorough discussion with the student about what they have done, what they've written so far, and what their thoughts are. This actually helps with the conclusion, because it helps the student know to start to flesh out those sort of implications, perhaps those assumptions, and they're able to evaluate them, to look at the significance of those things at this point, which I think helps with the writing of the conclusion. And then, of course, with any writing process, they have to revise, edit. Proofread is very important for criterion D, and then they produce a final copy. All right. Let me just stop a second to see if there is any quick questions I can answer. All right, so there seem to be still questions on the first part of the presentation. So I'll move on to unpacking the extended essay assessment criteria. All right, so as you're aware, there are 5 criteria, A, B, C, D, E. Criterion A is focus on method. It's marked out of 6 marks. So let me just quickly go through the criteria and what it's worth. The extended essay is worth 34 marks. A is worth 6, B is worth 6, C is worth 12, that's critical thinking, D is worth 4, and the reflections or engagement is worth 6 marks. So if my math is right, that should be 34. To get an A in extended essay, the range usually is 27 to 34. Can be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but more or less it's around about 27 to 34 to get an A in extended essay. So I'll break that down for you to see how this works, at least in my mind, how to guide your student towards a potential A. So let's look at the first criteria. Criterion A, focus on method. In my opinion, this is predominantly your introduction. You need to establish a topic, your research question, and your methodology. I have students in their introduction divide this into 2 paragraphs. So the first paragraph is you're establishing how you got to your research question. And the student usually ends it with the research questions. If you look on screen, here is an example of pretty much the first paragraph of the student who looked at Hillary Clinton's, how Hillary Clinton was represented in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So the first thing the student needs to do, according to the rubric, is that the student needs to establish why they've chosen this research question. And the student also needs to establish the critical perspective that they're going to be using. And all of this should lead into how did the research question, or why does this lead to the research question? So this is pretty much what the student has to do, in my opinion, in the first paragraph. The second paragraph is, this is a fragment of the student's second paragraph, but it outlines what will be in each chapter. So if you see here, the student has, firstly, this essay will explore the extent to which gendered language substantiates the argument that media reinforces gender biases through representation of female candidates. Secondly, the essay will review the manner. So the student is listing or highlighting what their chapters are going to be about. So you see, firstly, secondly, and thirdly. So this is the methodology the student has established. So if I quickly go back to the top, criterion A, topic, research, methodology. If the student is able to establish the critical lens that they're going to be using, if the student is able to establish how they got to the research question, and if the student is able to outline the way in which they're going to approach the essay, in the introduction, the student is almost guaranteed to capture these first 6 marks for criterion A, focus on method. So the introduction is very important because it sets up the essay, but more importantly, the student stands a chance of capturing these 6 marks or 5 of these 6 marks. One of the things that the student must do, the student must clearly state their research question. It cannot be stated as a statement, it must be stated as a question. I usually have my students put it in bold, so there's no question that there's a research question. That's probably a little bit of overkill, but I usually have my students put it in bold anyways. All right. Criterion B, knowledge and understanding that I mentioned. I think the biggest part of criterion B is the secondary sources that the student uses. So the student has to use subject-specific terminology, and the student has to discuss concepts related to the argument they're making. So if you look on screen here, let me give you an idea of what I suggest or recommend at least. If you look at this one, the student here has woven into the discussion the ideas of R.W. Connell. So I've put a word-looking circle around the part here that I think strengthens the knowledge and understanding the student is trying to communicate about their understanding of gendered language. More importantly, the theory or whatever the student uses in terms of secondary source is not the student's argument. The student has to use it to support their own argument. So the student can't just give the theory and leave it hanging, or just put the theorist argument up front as if it's their own. The theory has to be a way in which they are supporting their own arguments. Here is another example again on screen. And I've circled it again. So if you look where I've circled, that's where the student is inserting the theory. But if you see following that, the student says, this implies that. So the student is now looking at the theory and analyzing or discussing the implications that that has for their articles. So again, it's not just giving the theory, but it's using the theory as a means of supporting their own arguments or building on it for their own arguments, for that matter of fact. So it doesn't have to just be supporting, but they can be using it as a platform and then build on it to then make an extended argument, which is probably a little bit more critical, to be honest. All right, this is the big one. This is probably the hardest one to score on. Whenever I ask for my students' essays back, even students who get A's, it's difficult for them to get 10 on this one, let alone 11 and 12. Critical thinking is very difficult. So as language teachers or literature teachers as well, we're aware that the new rubrics for English has a criterion B, which is analysis and evaluation, which technically is critical thinking. If you are familiar with MYP and you know what the IB critical thinking, I think that's criterion C, you realize that one in MYP is actually analysis and evaluation. Now it's actually analysis, sorry. But overall it's analysis and evaluation. So analysis, this is my take on it. But analysis is always the effect it has in shaping meaning. So the student has to be discussing the way in which textual features have an ability or has an effect in shaping meaning. For most people, that turns out to be something like the effect on the reader is. So technically, that's what analysis is. But the IB has changed the rubric to include something else, which is evaluation. So this one is tricky, and this is the one that we have to figure out. According to the command terms, evaluation is the appraisal of the strengths and weaknesses. I'm paraphrasing, but the command term says evaluation is appraisal of the strengths and weaknesses. So students are being asked to appraise the strengths or weaknesses of the author's use of various techniques. So that becomes a bit tricky. But I think the keywords that the student wants to be using then in this case to ensure that they're evaluating techniques, they're looking at the effectiveness of the techniques, they're looking at the significance of the technique, they're looking at the importance of the techniques. I think if the student uses those sort of keywords as they go along in their writing of their analysis, then they would be doing evaluation as well. But to get critical thinking, the student has to hit these 4 pointers. They have to do research, they have to analyze, which is looking at the way in which meaning is shaped. They have to have a discussion about it, and they have to evaluate its significance. To get 12 marks, these are the four things the student has to do. So this is why I argue for some inclusion of theory, because it allows for the student to have a more critical analysis of the way in which meaning is being shaped, and allows them for a richer discussion, and also allows for them to look at the significance of the use of the particular terms that the author might be using. So that's my take on criterion C. It's a tricky one. It's the most difficult one. Statistically, it's the one that students in English score lower than any other. And it's simply this. Historically, when you look at EE reports, one of the things that the overall report, one of the things that the DP coordinators note in these reports is that critical thinking in English is hard to obtain, because critical thinking in, let's say, the more objective subjects, quote unquote, more objective subjects like science, the student can be more critical of the experiment that they're doing. They can identify the flaws in the work. They can identify flaws in previous experiments. In English, it's a bit tricky to ask a 17-year-old kid to say that, I don't know, Shakespeare's work isn't as good as it could be because of. So it's that part of the evaluation that they're looking for is a lot more tricky for a student to obtain. I've had students who've attempted that, but my recommendation is that if you're going to be critical, then you need some secondary source that supports your critique of the work. And so that can help them to sound more critical, but it can't just be them being critical of the work, saying that it wasn't good because. Here are some exemplars on screen of some of this sort of analysis that the student would be doing. So I'll stop there, pause there for a second for you to take a look at this one. Again, it's the same essay where the student was writing about the comparison between the way the Washington Post and the New York Times presents Clinton in a sort of androgynous manner. So if you look at the last sentence here, the SWJ used language to delineate, and the student goes on to try and have a sort of critical discussion about the way language is used in that newspaper. All right, so the critical thinking here, I think, is probably most important in the conclusion. This is something that I've brought over from my experiences at TOK Examiner over the years. In TOK essays, the conclusion is where the student really tries to hammer home their implications. And I find with success, students do the same thing in your extended essay. Just having the student do a sort of summarize and restate is not productive. It's not a productive use of 500 words or 250 words or whatever the conclusion is. Instead, I think this is where the student brings out their overall implications or overall evaluation. And this, again, is the boost for that critical thinking grade. So, and that's why I have that interview before the student writes the conclusion. And I have this sort of discussions, the student is taking notes and they're trying to flesh out these bigger ideas about their implications, what they think their finding is, how they feel about the research question now. Do they have an actual answer to the research question? Is it something that they can't answer? Many times the question, the question that they, or the answer that they went in with, their sort of hypothetical, their conceptual hypothesis, sorry, that they went in with is completely turned over. Let me give you an example of that. I had a student who, she got an A for an extended essay as well, but she did how Fox News and CNN represented the Ferguson riots. And she went in with a sort of probably bias, thinking that CNN would have been more objective in their presentation of the news. But after writing her extended essay, she had to admit that Fox was actually more objective in their presentation of the facts. And so that, after our discussion, is what came out in her extended essay, in her conclusion, sorry, which again was part of her critical thinking, because she recognized that CNN presented more expert information, a lot more additional coverage to their reporting, but all of this was leaning towards their predisposition. Whereas Fox News, not the commentators now, but Fox News, they presented the facts as it was. To some extent, maybe omitting a few things here and there that might suit their agenda, perhaps, but generally speaking, she thought that Fox News presented more of a factual account, whereas CNN presented in their news a little bit more additional information, but it was more one-sided. So that was an interesting finding that she brought it in her conclusion to strengthen her critical thinking argument. And again, this is something I think needs to be part of the conclusion, a big part of the conclusion. So on screen is an example from an extract from the student's conclusion, where she was talking about her findings with looking at both newspapers. And in essence, what she realized was that there wasn't a difference between both. Both newspapers used gendered language to present Hillary Clinton. She went in again with a sort of bias, thinking that the Democratic or more liberal newspaper would have been more favorable in their use of gendered language, and the conservative newspaper would have been more demeaning in their use of gendered language. But what she found is that both of them gendered Hillary Clinton to suit their own agenda, so to speak. So it wasn't a matter of fact that one newspaper was presenting her more feminine. Both were using gendered language, but using the gendered language to either present her more favorably because she's capable of leading, because she has masculine traits, or the other one was presenting her with these masculine traits to diminish her femininity. But it was interesting, again, and this came out in the conclusion. Good question. There's a question right here about using second person, first person. Yes. I have a colleague who is a principal examiner, and she's a stickler for using first person. She wants students to say, use the third person always. She thinks it ruins the essay. This is what I say to my students. In the introduction, there are parts of it where the rubric requires the student to state why they chose the extended essay. I think it's awkward for a student to be talking in third person about why they personally chose an essay. So there are parts of it, especially introduction, where I think speaking in first person can be useful. And in the conclusion, again, as in the case of this student, this is what she found, and she wrote in the first person. If you're not comfortable with your student writing in first person, then don't advise them to do it. There are examiners out there who have problems with students writing in the first person. However, in a sort of holistic manner, the IB, generally speaking, does not make an issue with something a student does, spelling, etc., as long as the student is consistent. So even though I'm marking Lang and Lit IOs, and one of the things that they've said now is that there is a shift with the use of pronouns, for example. So again, as examiners, we need to be aware of this. If students are using gender neutral pronouns, that should not affect their grade in any way, as long as they're consistent. So I think the big thing here is always going to be consistency. Cara, I hope I pronounced your name right.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Right. So this is probably the easiest rubric to get 4 marks on. Criterion, sorry, to get 4 marks on. Presentation. This is where the student just doesn't need to make silly mistakes. And this comes back over and over in the subject report. Students don't use they're mispaginated. So in the table of contents, they have page 6 for chapter 2, and chapter 2 appears on page 8. Those are just like small things you're losing unnecessary marks from. The topic should be on the title page. It's not a requirement, but again, these are small things that examiners might look at that you would lose marks. So you should have the topic as well as a research question in your title page. Your table of content should be well done, properly paginated. Again, simple things like having the lines and the numbers in a zigzag. Those are simple things that the student can avoid. Presentation, really, that's part of it. The student must have a bibliography or works cited, depends on what you want to call it. Generally speaking, as far as I understand it, the IB is more keen on the student having a works cited than a bibliography. Though if the student wants to have a bibliography as a safeguard, that's fine. Because it might be the case that something that they've read and they've used and unwittingly included in the extended essay, a bibliography can serve as a protection for that. But the IB is more interested in works cited. It doesn't matter if you use Chicago, AP, MLA, the IB doesn't care about which one you use as long as the student is consistent from the start. I use MLA with my students simply because that's the one that's stuck in my head since university. So I can pick up the errors quickly with an MLA as opposed to AP or Chicago. But that's just my choice. So you could do the same if you want, but the IB doesn't care what you use as long as there's consistency. I think the word you should always take from this is consistency. Doesn't matter what you do as long as the student is consistent. If the student is using 3 different formatting through the essay, you're losing marks. So citations and references are important. In-text citations are important. The examiners are not required to read footnotes. So there's no point in putting elaborate footnotes in your extended essay. Examiners won't read it because they don't have to anymore. So you should make sure that what you've written, everything you want the examiner to read is in your 4,000 words. Can you have a footnote? Yes, but not an extension in terms of giving definition, stuff like that. It might be just a link or a reference to something, but not something extensive. Really, go with in-text citations if you're asking me. But footnotes, sorry, extensive footnotes, that students in the past used to use it to get around the 4,000 words. So they put this another 50 words here, another 20 here, another 30. So before you know it, extended essay is not 4,000 words, it's like 7,000 words, right? So that's a no-no. And the layout is important. This is the easiest marks to get, the easy 4 marks. And if you write a good introduction, that's 10. So okay. Hearings. Ask that person to mute. Hopefully they can mute. Right. So easy 4 marks for presentation. So Yasmin, can we move to our second activity, please?
Sure, sure. I've just sent the link in the Padlet, and I'm just going to create breakout rooms now.
Unfortunately, time is against us, so this happens. It's a good essay, though. I like this student's work, so I'm pretty sure you can get some pointers from it.
Yes, I agree. I thought this was quite a mature piece of work, actually. I was very surprised that this was by eyes. Yeah.
We were wondering something at the end of our work, and since the work has less than 3,500 words, we were wondering if that will be penalized on
No.
not right?
No. All right. So the IB now has a new thing. The IB is moving away from having penalties to what is called self-penalizing. So if the student doesn't hit the word count, then it's self-penalizing, right? So if a student is still able to write a strong extended essay in 3,500 words, there's no penalty. So they're not losing marks for being under the word count. And they don't even lose marks for being over either. So the IB doesn't even take marks for being over, they don't take marks off for being over the word count. So what happens now is that the examiner is supposed to use their discretion, so to speak, and kind of get a sense when they think the student is significantly or is over the word count. So if a student writes 4,010 words, it's not likely that they'll be penalized, because what the examiner is supposed to do is stop reading at 4,000. So if I'm reading and it looks like 4,000, it's fine. But when it clearly doesn't look like 4,000, then I'm going to stop to check where is 4,000, and the examiner is probably going to cross a line, and then it would be self-penalizing in that sense, because then the conclusion, which might have the implications, probably wouldn't be read by the examiner. So that's the IB's new thrust. They now call it self-penalizing. So being under or over is the student's peril, so to speak. All right, Yasmin, are we all back?
Yes, we're good.
All right, cool. Thanks. All right. So let's move on to the last one. I know you guys have some ideas about an extended essay. I'll say this: the maturity comes out of, at least in my opinion, the student's ability to engage with the theory. So once the student saw her 2 speeches and listened to her speeches, she realized that both Emma Watson and Malala were making pretty much the same point in those 2 speeches, but the way in which they attacked it or they presented it was different. So what the student realized is that Emma Watson's speech was more I-centric. She was more speaking from a I perspective, like this is my story and giving more personal anecdotes, where Malala was speaking more from a collective perspective, speaking on behalf of girls. So then that's when she decided to look at it from a theoretical perspective. Of course, with my guidance, I pointed her towards using some sort of theory that could help. In this case, was speech act theory. And so the speech act theory helped her to talk about the way in which one might have been more persuasive and one might have been more action-based, and how that worked with it, looking from a prelocutionary versus an illocutionary manner. And that's where the check-ins also help, because the student is writing, they're thinking, and then they're explaining to you the thought process, and then you can actually chime in on that thought process. So without actually giving written feedback. So that's my take on that. But we're running short on time, so I'm going to go into probably what some of you might consider a very important element, which it is actually. It's the engagement, or the RPPF. The RPPF is graded. I remember my very first extended essay where the RPPF was done. I didn't tell the student to take it as serious as they should have, and I think it probably cost them a couple of marks, especially trying to get into the A band. It's worth 6 marks. So technically, if the student does it well, along with criterion D and E, even if A, B, and C is based on nonsensical repetition, the student still passes their extended essay. Because to get a D, it's 7 and above, 7 to 12. I'll show you the grade bounds in a bit. So just doing engagements actually can allow the student to pass their extended essay. Here, the 2 points it looks at is a process and research focus. I saw a comment that someone says that the student can still get around using the first person. I'm paraphrasing the comment, but get around using the first person by using the RPPF, the reflection forms. I agree. The reflection forms are definitely first person. The thing about the reflection form is that each reflection should focus on a particular part of the process. So I think the first one needs to or should focus on how the student developed that research question and the refining of it possibly. So this one, the first reflection happens early out, and the student stops and writes 150 words perhaps, explaining the process that led to developing a research question. And that's probably a very interesting process because they would have gone through the various topics they would have thought about, the theory that they encountered, the lit review that they did. So that would be a very meaningful discussion there. Students would shy away from trivial conversations about why they liked a book, or the difficulty they think between choosing a book, or why they think the extended essay was so difficult. That's not what the examiner is looking for. They're looking for more meaningful, practical engagements with different processes of the extended essay. The second one, again, I would recommend is the crafting of an outline. This would have happened after they moved from the research question, and more often than not, this process is one where the student actually re-edits and reshapes the essay. Sometimes it might be a case where they started out thinking that their chapters would be based on different literary theories, and then it turns out that they shift to looking at different aspects of a character or characters. These things are important in terms of looking at the crafting of the outline and explaining why they made that shift. The last one could be reflection on the feedback. Some schools, most people make this one the Viva voucher. So students would have done the Viva voucher, and they would have had this sort of discussion with you, and you might allow them to record it or at least take notes, and then that they use to help write their final reflection in terms of thinking what they could have done differently if they were to do it over. Maybe what was what they think they learned, what process helped them develop more as a writer, perhaps. A little bit more critical discussion about that the ending of the project. Of course, we know that the RPPFs are part of the authentication of the student's work, because if the student can't really show engagement, then it raises questions about if this essay is actually their work. I have a first reflection here on screen, again, using the same essay, so it's easy for you to relate to it. It's the same essay where the student did Hillary Clinton. They looked at the representation of Hillary Clinton. And you see here where the student started out with a completely different research question from the one that they ended up with. Let me just pause on that for a second so you can look at it. All right, then crafting of the outline, the student now looks at how they move from that sort of different research question into developing this idea about narrowing their research question. So this student here has looked at, they haven't really looked at crafting outline necessarily here, but what they've done is shown the development of their essay, the work that they're doing, the lit review that they've done. So they're focusing on some aspect of the writing process here. And the final one here, the student looks at this one comes out of the Viva voucher, and some of the questions that were asked, and the student now has developed this final reflection based on that. As I said, this essay got an A. And usually I say to students, 150 for the first one, 150 for the second one, 200 for the third one. The total RPF is 500 words. The examiner will not read more than 500 words. So if the student has 550, by the time it gets to the final part of the reflection, they'll just not read the last 50 words. And that's not good for the student, because especially in third reflection, that might be a very important 50 words that they should read. So we need to be careful about that. So the final activity before we go, let's try and do it quickly. Maybe you won't do it in 15 minutes. You might get 5 or 7 minutes perhaps. Yasmet, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that should be good. I'm just going to share the Padlet link again with you all.
All right. So this is the last one here that we're going to do. Well, and this one you're looking at an RPPF and thinking how much you would give it out of 6. This should be an easier read. It's just 500 words. So it should be an easier read.
And your breakout room starts now.
All right, Yasmin, are we back?
Yes. In about 10 seconds, I believe everybody will be in the call.
Okay. Just want to just respond to some of the questions that I'm seeing popping up. We also remember now when the student is using theory, remember that there is no real expectation, first of all, the student does use theory. And secondly, the student who does attempt to use lit theory or linguistic theory, I think at least, and I don't have data to support this, but at least historically with my students, the students who go a traditional sort of looking solely on the theme or the characterization, I think that student tends to have more of a burden for their essay to be distinguished amongst essays. I think the student who attempts to use lit theory, even if they don't do it as well as we would like them to do it, I think that student still has an edge in terms of their critical thinking marks, or just the impression that the essay gives to the examiners in terms of the knowledge and understanding the student is displaying. So both approaches are doable. My opinion, I think without the lens of the theoretical lens, I think it's a little bit harder for the student to distinguish themselves, especially in critical thinking marks. This person says, I think it's Vidya, I hope I'm pronouncing him right, in essays where 2 text works are used, does the student need to compare and contrast between them? The only category that requires a comparison is category 2. Category 1 isn't a comparison. So the student can talk about 2 texts from the same author and look at something that the writer portrays. The student can talk about 2 different texts without looking at a comparison of them or a contrast of them. Don't know how feasible it is, but it's not a requirement. So the answer is no. Oh, there was a breakout room that was harsh, gave this essay 12. I posted the grades in the box in terms of after it was marked and we asked back for the essay, we got the grades from the examiner, and that's what the student received. The Viva Vouchers, Silvana, is an exit interview of sorts. The IB requires it. So at the end of the process, you're supposed to have a Viva Voucher. Most schools use it as the 3rd reflection. So the student sits with you and have this discussion about the whole process of writing and what they learned. It's one way for you to be able to say that this is the student's work, because as the supervisor, you're required to sign to the authenticity of the work. Let me see. Christine, to some extent, the IB has become more explicit with the use of theory. If you look at the teacher support material for Lang and Lit, the IB actually now makes it explicit that you're supposed to teach theory. So previously it was optional, but with the new iteration of Lang and Lit, it is no longer optional. You are expected to teach theory. All right. Let me see if I can take one more before we move on. How much time do we have, Yasmin? Are we running out of time? I'm never good with time.
So we have about 3 to 4 minutes left now.
So we're running out of time. All right. So while writing an E, can we compare and contrast with 2 like 1 characters? And not sure I'm following that question. I'm trying to read fast. Sorry about that. All right. I posted the grades up in the chat just a little bit above. It's 6, 5, 10, 4 for A, B, C, D, E. And I think the student got 5 for the reflection. So they got, yes, there it is. Thank you, Yasmin. All right. So the last thing, pretty much the last thing I want to talk to you about was the grade boundaries. So you get a sort of mathematical way of approaching your students' extended essays. So as you can see, if the student does a good reflection and they do a good layout presentation, then the student potentially can get 10 marks. So the student is already a D without writing an extended essay of sorts. So failing an E in English is, I don't know how you fail an E in English. It's just not possible once they've done a reflection and they've written and they have actually presented the extended essay reasonably. So this should get at least 9 marks there, right? So the low end is easy to achieve. The high end is difficult. To get to 27, we can do a little bit of math. So let's leave the critical thinking out, the 12 marks out. The student needs to do well on criterion A, means write a good introduction, lay out the methodology, research question, try and get 6 there. Then the student does well on knowledge and understanding and try and get the 6 marks there. So that's 12. And they would get the 10 from D and E. So that's 22. So that means the student needs minimum 5 to get to an A, to 27. Now, obviously, the student is not going to score perfectly in all of those criteria. So the student usually needs a minimum of 9, in my opinion, from criterion D to hit, to get an A. So in other words, mathematically speaking, if the student writes a very good introduction and does secondary research and weaves it into their essay, they should be able to get 10 from A and B. And if the student does a good job of the outline, the presentation, sorry, and reflections, they should be able to get 9 or 8 from that. So you're looking at about 18 minimum from A, B, D, and E. So that's why I'm saying students usually need a minimum of 9 on criterion A, on criterion C, sorry, to get an A. That's the difficult criteria. I've not had a student who scored 12 on criterion C yet. This idea of the evaluation and the analysis is just a hard one. And if you teach language and literature, you realize it's a tricky criteria anyway with all of the other assessments. This idea of critical thinking, it's not just about shaping meaning, but it's also the student evaluating. This evaluation is hard for students to nail. So I think if the student nails the other criteria, A, B, D, and E, aces those and falls short maybe 2 or 3 marks, then they should be able to score an A. So that means something as simple as proofreading and messing up page lines could actually stop a student from getting an A, as simple as that. So those other things that I've mentioned before are very important. Looking at D, looking at E, making sure you have a good introduction, do the research, weave that into the essay. Those are the things that matter, because in the end, if you get those simple things right, then the critical thinking that usually in English isn't in the highest band, the student can still get an A for the extended essay. So we have maybe a minute or 2 left, Yasmin?
Yeah, we're running out of time. It's already, we are just up for 1 minute. So yeah, I think.
So if there are any last minute burning questions, just pop them in right now and I'll try to respond to them as quickly as I possibly can.
Yeah, so someone has written if you would be open to share what are the open resources website for EE, any resource websites?
Yes, there are. All right, so I think I probably didn't put a link in, but there are resource websites, and that I will add to the Padlet later on that you can use. How many primary sources can one have? There is no limit on it really. I think the student, usually, I'll tell you from my example, so this is not mathematical in any way, but students who get A's usually have no less than 15 secondary sources on their extended essay. That's been my experience. Yes, I think my LinkedIn information is shared, so you can get me on LinkedIn very easily. Messages come to my phone. So it seems as if we're out of time, are we?
Yeah.
Should the students have more primary or secondary sources? Well, the primary sources is not optional, right? Just the last response to that one. Primary sources are not optional. Without primary sources, there's no extended essay. So the student must have the novel that they're working with or the speeches. Those are the primary sources. Those have to be analyzed. And then they can have the secondary sources to supplement that. So hopefully you found this helpful. And thank you very much as well. Thank you to all the people who are saying thank you. You're all welcome.
Donald, if you could just move to the next slide.
Okay, yes, sorry.
yeah, so we would all like really love for you to share your feedback. So if you have any, please write back to susan@toddlelab.com. Also, as I mentioned right in the beginning, we have a Toddle platform walkthrough right now to show you how Toddle can help you with the EE process at your school. It is going to take place at 1:30 p.m. GMT after closing the session. So you can join using the link that I'm just going to post in the chat. Just give me a moment. You all can just copy this link, and if you're interested, just pop in. Also, yeah, I would just like to thank you, Donald, once again for the wonderful, wonderful session today. And I'm sure everyone who joined in is taking away very useful insights from you. So thanks a lot. You all will also get like a little short survey for you to complete after this session. So we would also love to hear back from you on how we can accommodate your requests for our next sessions. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody who joined in. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.